Welcome to Selling Circular, the podcast dedicated to exploring the innovative minds and business models shaping our transition to a circular economy. I'm Garr, CEO of LoopLayer. Sabir Lakhani, not here again for the intro or the interview, but hopefully will be joining us shortly as we've got some stuff on the calendar and she's going to be coming back in and out of maternity leave. Today, I loved our conversation. We're going to deep dive into territory that might challenge how you think about economics, finance, and what success even means in today's economy. My guest is Matt Orsagh, co-founder of the CFA Institute for Post-Growth Finance. He himself, a chartered financial analyst and a 17-year veteran of the CFA Institute, where he served as senior director of capital markets policy, focusing on corporate governance, ESG, environmental social governance, and climate change analysis. Here's what makes Matt's perspective so rare. He didn't just come at these ideas from an activist lens. He actually came from inside the machine. The corporate governance and governance metrics of the early 2000s is where he really got his start, and being really at the forefront of seeing the founding meetings that launched the UN principles of responsible investment. He watched ESG go from kind of a niche fringe concept to a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and then in recent years has kind of watched it flounder and fail a little bit to move the needle on things that actually matter in our economy. And so this intellectual lineage is really important and worth understanding as we listen to the interview. It's really important because ultimately he's going to talk a lot about many authors, whether it's MIT researchers that published The Limits of Growth from the Club of Rome, modeling what happens when exponential economic growth collides with finite resources, and ultimately really looking at that their conclusion is coming true. And so that's the context that Matt is operating in our conversation today. And archaea, ultimately, and as he talks about, it means enough in Greek. It's the building of sort of the intellectual infrastructure for what comes after our growth-obsessed economy. This is really a podcast about degrowth. Again, we'll talk more about degrowth. I talk about what it's like to wrestle with concepts around growth that matters so much to our economy, so much to all of our livelihoods, but that ultimately assign us numbers and make us all value in integers rather than trying to focus on what brings us together and how to make happy, healthy communities. And that's really where this is challenging those concepts. It's with Matt and his co-founders, Anastasia Lin and Steve Rocco. They bring complementary expertise in their finance and their sustainability research. And their first white paper, I loved. It's called By Disaster or Design. We reference it many times in the interview. And it's been sparking conversations from Harvard Law School all the way to the European Parliament. And it's really about how are we getting to where we're headed in the future. And we can do it, as Matt talks about again in the interview, we can do it through conversation and collaboration and trying to figure out where we are headed, or it's just going to happen to us. And so their second white paper actually talks about a path to post-growth pensions, where we actually talk about what does this mean for the financial instruments of our future. And that was published very recently. It's actually what caught my attention and takes these ideas even further, arguing that pension funds, which control roughly $58 trillion in global assets, are kind of legally bound and trapped in a growth mandate that actively undermines our future, the future really that our beneficiaries and us that we hope to retire into. That paper proposes multi-capital frameworks that really focus on what does retirement mean beyond financial returns, and how do you invest in natural capital, community resilience, and the care economy for everyone that needs to be taken care of in the future. And it's really, I think their work really attempts to answer, well, the foundational question of what does retirement actually look like when our growth, or maybe excessive growth economy, ends. This conversation gets personal. It gets maybe a little uncomfortable. It challenges concepts that I hold dear. We talk about the 7 stages of grief when we're trying to reconcile our current economy, and it doesn't pull punches. Here's my conversation with Matt Orsagh. My first question is really about, in our previous conversation we had before we started hitting record, was around those golden, you sort of mentioned golden handcuffs, golden cage,
Mm-hmm.
being a professional that's sort of locked into an industry, of which my opening question is really about how you decided to kind of buck that career path a little bit. Spending 17 years at CFA Institute and then saying, okay, I'm in the heart of mainstream finance. How do I change this? How do I change my career towards this new trajectory? And I would love to better understand, because I think it helps professionals all around us better understand, when does that moment present itself? And then how do you act on that?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a little bit of story. I'll try to make it short about how I got to where I was.
It's a podcast. We don't have to make anything short.
Yeah. Fast forward. This is too boring for you people.
Yeah. No.
I'm a middle-aged white guy in my 50s. So I graduated school in the university in the mid-90s. And I was an English and film major because I love stories and a storyteller, and those are the things I liked. I had the mistaken idea that that's what you study in college, the things you like. My parents allowed that. It was nice of them. But after a couple of years of working, I realized I need to get myself another degree to make myself more useful, more marketable, and just to learn more and be more useful to the world. So I went and got a business degree. I got a finance degree, an MBA. And then I lived in Atlanta at the time. That's where my family was. And I had a friend who needed a roommate in New York. And I was like, I've got a finance degree. I'll move to New York. This is going to work out perfectly. It worked out okay. It was a little naive, but it worked out okay. And I started in the corporate governance world. Corporate governance is how corporations are governed. I hooked up with this firm, Governance Metrics International, became part of MSCI, that a lot of people have probably heard of. And what we were doing at the time, and this is 25 years ago, is looking at the corporate governance of companies around the world. And this is pre-Enron and WorldCom and all those things. So there's some pretty sketchy stuff going on. It was very, very interesting times to be reading a lot of proxies about all the terrible things companies are doing. One of my favorites was there was a French company. I forget who it was. It was like a luxury company or a perfume company or someone and like that. And this is, again, 25 years ago. But these were some of the practices back then. One of the boards was getting guff from its shareholders that it was too pale, male, and stale. That it was too, it was just a bunch of old white guys. And so to answer that, the CEO of the company put his 19-year-old daughter on the board.
Oh, great move.
Yeah. So that's the kind of atmosphere. Some great stories came out of that. And that's just one. There's a lot of stuff like that. So that's where I got my start. Then I started to get my CFA designation, Chartered Financial Analyst. And that's kind of a level above an MBA, for those who don't know. You're either, you like finance or you're either a masochist at that point. It's just a lot of study.
Exactly.
You study for 3 years for 3 different tests. It's a bear, but I got through it. Go ahead.
I got a couple friends. No, I know that. I know those. They're going through it.
Yeah. The funny thing was I lived in New York at the time, and I had a couple of friends who were bartenders, and they always wanted to work the weekend of the CFA exam because you had all these people in their 20s and 30s who were studying for months on end. And then that weekend, they would just go crazy. And so because they let loose because it was always the weekend after Memorial Day was the test. Now it's computerized and stuff, but it was always a sit down, pencil and paper and calculator test back then. And people would want to be bartending that day because they would do very well. But anyway, so I did that. Then I actually joined the CFA Institute because they had started and CFA Institute has financial professionals around the world that take this test. So there's a New York society and a UK society and a Japan society and all that stuff. So it's international. And I joined, they had just started at the time, a think tank arm of CFA Institute. And so the idea was kind of to fight the good fight for shareholders' rights and the corporate governance stuff I was doing. And right around the same time, ESG started. My first assignment there was to be part of the Principles of Responsible Investment meetings that led to the PRI that the UN put together. And those letters everybody knows now, ESG, it started then. It started about 20 years ago. And so my career kind of went along with that. Started out with the G of governance, but I did more and more research and writing and speaking around the world on these issues. And so I became a sustainability professional, during that. And I was doing that research writing and speaking on sustainability issues. And over the years, I realized that the sustainability that I come up with wasn't really doing the job. Things like climate change and overshoot and planetary boundaries weren't really being addressed. And I started coming across the issues of degrowth and ecological economics about 6 or 7 years ago in my research. I stumbled upon them because I was researching other things. And those things started to make sense. And so over time, I would put that, I started a podcast on sustainability while I was in my last couple of years at CFA Institute, and I would talk about some of these subjects. I had someone, Timothy Parikh, on my podcast, and it happened to be it was interesting. It happened to be the podcast that was the most downloaded of any other one when I was there. And I had people from all over the sustainability spectrum. And that told me that people, and these were finance people who were listening to this. This wasn't some far leftist group or anything, pretty conservative folks in finance. But it told me that, I wasn't alone in thinking these things were an answer. And that a lot of people felt similar, that they wanted a better system, a better way. And so and in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, someone should be doing this just as a think tank, just on degrowth and ecological economics, because the neoclassical economics that you and I learned in school isn't fit for purpose for a well-being economy within planetary boundaries. And we can talk about what that means.
Yeah.
And then COVID happened, and CFA Institute gets their revenue from people taking the exam. And for about a year and a half, very few people took the exam. And so that hit CFA Institute hard. I wasn't at revenue center because I was in part of the think tank arm, and eventually I got laid off. And so the thing I was thinking of doing anyway, I started doing. And so now here we are doing our mission at Archaeologist Institute is the name of the place we started, the think tank we started. Archaeologist means enough in Greek. And so it's enough, we have enough to live a good life, or kind of enough of the system that doesn't work. And so for the past couple of years, myself and two colleagues have been doing the work of doing research, writing, speaking on those kind of issues. And our mission is to normalize these conversations about ecological economics and degrowth that I just stumbled upon 6 or 7 years ago. We want people to not get to their mid-40s before they come to these things. So I'll stop there.
Okay,
and
good.
Go there.
Well, no, you're hitting me early then. So that's good. I'm getting there. I think I love that term normalize, because often the term degrowth, for me, and I talk about this with our common friend John Mulrow, previous guest, it feels radical.
Yeah.
And when you start to see it, you can't, for at least for me, what often happens is I can't unsee it. And it does become a little bit more normalized.
Yeah.
But what does that mean in terms of how you are presenting these topics when you're coming in, you're walking into a room full of new CFA professionals, and you're now introducing these topics in ways that are normalizing, but then kind of opening up a new lens for them? How do you first do that? What are the opening sentences when you're presenting this to a new group of folks?
Well, and we were talking about this before we started recording. The first paper we wrote last year was called By Disaster Design. And the idea is, by disaster design, a post-growth world is coming. We're past planetary boundaries, and we're far past, the limits of climate change. And so, unwanted things are going to be happening in our economies and our societies and our environments because we haven't dealt with these problems.
Right.
So change is coming. A post-growth world where we're not focused on growth is coming, either by disaster design. Let's design it. So the paper was, and this is kind of when I'm talking to someone, this is the argument, kind of how the argument goes, is first I kind of lay out what is this I'm talking about? What are the problems with neoclassical economics? How does ecological economics address those? What is degrowth? What is systems thinking? That kind of stuff. The second part of the paper, since we're kind of a finance think tank, was what does this mean for finance going forward?
Yeah.
It means a lot of change. I encourage people to read the paper, but it means finance will probably shrink. And then third is...
And to frame that real quickly, I mean, I would love, because I think it's quite topical in terms of finance needing to be shrinking in terms of its outsized impact on the economy. Like right now, I think it's and this just maybe to put this very simply for a listener, we just keep being hit over the head with the fact that our economy means stock market and GDP.
Yeah.
and how little that is the case. And so I think that's sort of unwrapping that for the lay listener and for the newcomer to this. Please.
Yeah, let's circle back to that GDP. Because that's an important part of it.
Yeah.
But we talk about how our economies have become over financialized, and finance used to mean financing a bridge or a school or a road or things that, as Warren Buffett famously said, you could drop on your foot and it hurts.
Right.
That a real product, real something. Not that services weren't important, but now so much of finance is just moving things from one computer screen to another computer screen, kind of a casino kind of place that finance has become, and who can arbitrage better and who can trade faster to get an advantage. That doesn't do anything really for society.
I mean, in my world, that often happens which is startup land of circular economy. Some of the most investable products from a finance perspective are the most asset light.
Yeah.
So if you're not actually touching physical assets, that makes you more attractive to finance. And so I think
because you don't have a warehouse somewhere, or
exactly,
or you don't have employees,
Right.
And so
I interrupted though. Yes.
No, that's fine. So and then the third part of our paper and the third part of this argument is kind of hand-holding with people. It's like, I know this is strange. I know this is hard. It's kind of the metaphor I use is like, this journey that I was on is kind of like the 7 stages of grief. The first is denial, and you get to acceptance at the end, but there's a whole lot in between that. There's bargaining and anger and all those other fun things where, when I first started hearing about climate change and those problems, it was like, it's not that big a deal, right? We'll take care of that. Somebody will take care of that. And then the more you look into it, it's like, well, no, they're not. It's not going to be taken care of. You're like, but no, it's not that big of a problem. And, compromising and all that stuff. And finally, I've gotten to, it wasn't a day on the calendar where I got to acceptance. It was a process, and it's the same for everybody. And that, we are, as a storyteller, I think of things in stories, and, we are the stories we tell ourselves as people, as societies. And there's a whole lot of untruths in there sometimes as well. I mean, you can go all the way back to Copernicus, who, was the first. He wasn't the first to say that the earth revolved around the sun. That was actually something back in ancient Egypt they were thinking about and talking about, but it didn't kind of get normalized till Copernicus came along. And even when he did, and he convinced people of it, there was still, a huge backlash. So we were kind of lying to ourselves about our place in the universe and the cosmos, and everyone was fine with that for most of human history. But it wasn't true. And so it's the same kind of story. It's like, capitalism is great and neoliberal, economics is great until it isn't. It's lifted a lot of people out of poverty. It's given us all these great toys, but it has a downside in that we overproduce and overconsume, and we overuse resources, and we don't pay for it in our lives. We don't adequately price things to where we're not destroying our futures. We throw away, I saw a stat around Christmas, of course, from an article that we throw away about 80% of our Christmas presents.
Oh my gosh.
So, what does that say? We have this whole, this is a whole different podcast, the history of Christmas and all that stuff. It started as a pagan celebration to celebrate the harvest, right? I mean, you couldn't get further from where we are now. And then Jesus's birth, which was actually apparently in July or something, in order for better marketing, got put around Christmas. And then that took over Christmas. And then about 100 years or so ago, Santa Claus took over. And I'm not bashing any of this stuff. I'm just telling
probably somewhere. Yeah, probably somewhere in Coca-Cola has to do more with that too. Yes.
I forget who it was, but there was a podcast like, did Coca-Cola invent Santa Claus? It's like, no.
Acquired. Yes.
Acquired.
I think
kind of co-opted some of it, but yes. But
right.
And so now we have this holiday that, is the whole antithesis of what it started as, celebrating the harvest and Mother Earth and all that stuff. That's actually destroying the earth, because we have to keep this growth engine going, or we don't know what to do with ourselves. And we're told that and we can, you're going to ask about GDP later. We can get there now if you want to go. But
Let's go ahead.
for most of human history, growth wasn't a thing. It just it wasn't, not that no one cared about it, but it wasn't a way to organize our societies and organize what success is. There's, I kind of think of two, and I've written about this and talked about this in other podcasts, but there's kind of two big ideas in the last 100 years that I think have helped us along. And they're not by no means the only things that have happened, but just to give you an idea of how the story grows and the way the stories we tell ourselves change. Back in the 1920s, there was this, Paul Mazur, I think was his name. I forget how you spell it, but he was and you can look this up if people want. He was like a Wall Street executive at one of the big banks, and he wrote about how we need to convince mankind that their wants are their needs, that they have to have the things they want, and they should never be satisfied with what they have. That really wasn't a concept before that. And it's interesting, like Sigmund Freud's, I think, nephew was one of the first guys in the advertising industry that started, I forget his name, that first started professionalizing it. And he used what he'd learned from his uncle about exploiting our feelings of inadequacy and all those kind of things. Great stuff, exploiting us in our needs to belong and all those things to sell stuff. Before that, advertising was very quaint. It was like, you want buttons, we have buttons. That's it. It wasn't much more. It wasn't much more sophisticated than that. And now, just watch this. I'm not, I don't think advertising is great, but like watch the Super Bowl or anything, and just watch it critically when you're watching ads. It's like, what are they trying to tell me? They're trying to tell you this beer will make you fit in, this car will complete you, and all those kind of things. And of course it won't. And and then couple that with the second thing that came along back in the 1930s. There's an economist, Simon Kuznets, in the U.S. who was tasked with, and this is an interesting story to look up as well. He was tasked with finding a better way to measure success in the U.S. economy. And what he came up with was GDP. Not that revolutionary at the time, but if you think about it, he was just adding up everything. Adding up all the goods and services we produce or any nation produces. He actually warned at the time that this shouldn't be used as a way to measure well-being, because it's not that. But of course, over time it grew. And you put those two things together, you're never enough. You always need to have more. And the way we measure success is by always producing more. And over time, and then add in the neoclassical economics that really took off in the 60s and 70s as the main purpose of corporations is to return value to shareholders. Couple that with, we always need to grow. GDP is how we measure success. Couple that with that, advertising of you're always inadequate. You always need more. We're in a death machine, of you're never good enough. You always need more. If it's destroying the environment, that doesn't matter because we need to grow. We always need to grow. That didn't really matter up to the point where about 1970 was the first year where we as a civilization, a global civilization, started producing more than nature could handle. We kind of got into deficit of nature couldn't reproduce enough wood and minerals and water and stuff. We overspent on our ecological footprint for the first time. And we've been doing that for, the last 50 plus years, 55, 56 years. So that bill is coming due and pushing past the planetary boundaries. And the planetary boundaries is a framework that scientists came up with about 15, 20 years ago. And it measures 9 different systems that are our life support system, frankly. Climate is just one. But we've passed 7 of 9 planetary boundaries: climate, land use, which is mostly deforestation, water use, biodiversity, plastics, novel entities, which is phosphorus and nitrogen in our water system and poisons our oceans and stuff. And then ocean acidification. All those have pushed past what's safe. And that's making our environments break down. And our economies are only in our environment, so that's going to break down. So if we don't do anything by disaster design, we will get to a place where this all breaks down. And we're starting to see it. So that's a long version of the conversation you asked about, how do I bring this to people? I try to meet people where they are. The conversation with, my dad is different than a conversation with a 20-year-old, I'm going to talk
Yep.
to at university in 2 weeks. The conversation I had, after we wrote our paper, I was at my son's soccer game, and one of the parents from my son's team came over and started talking to me about the paper. I didn't talk to him about it. He just knew who I was. There's only one Matt Orsagh on the earth, so I can't hhide.
Yeah.
But it was cool. It's like this dad who knows that this is a problem wanted to learn more about it. And so, you understand where a person's coming from. You try to kind of meet people where they live, and tell them that this is just the truth. It's just physics and chemistry. It's not political in any way. This is the physics and chemistry that ruled when the dinosaurs were extinct.
Right.
The neoclassical economics we invented wasn't around then. It's just over the past 50, 60 years, we've been told this is the story we've been told. And it's not some kind of conspiracy. It's just people acting in their own self-interest. And I'll stop. I'll just want to say one more thing and I'll stop.
Please.
But so it's important for people to understand that, this isn't the natural way of societies to organize themselves. There really isn't a right or a wrong way or a natural way. It's societies organize themselves in many different ways and all through time. A great book, if people want to read, is it's a huge doorstop of a book. It's about 700 pages, but the last 200 pages are just notes. That's how big it is. It's oh God, no, I can't remember the name of it.
When it hits you.
Yeah. Well, can you? You might have to pause it here for a second.
No, this is great. We can. It'll hit you. While we're on that thought, and while it's coming back to you, kind of a simplistic question here in the frame of all of this, but how do you talk to the 20-something versus how you talk to the 70-something? Like this, when you're talking to your father, where you're talking to maybe a college grad, there's got to be, just the frameworks of their lives are completely different.
Yeah.
Because your father would have grown up with much more of the selling of a button than the 20-something, in which that is just completely not even in the same framework of the way they've been raised.
Well, someone my age or my father's age, your brain, this isn't a physically real thing, but like your brain is harder. Yeah. Your brain isn't as facile. It isn't as open to new ideas. The story you've told yourself, you've been telling yourself for 50, 60, 70 years.
Plasticity is down. Yes.
Yeah, and you're locked into that story. And when you're 20, you're like, okay, well, yeah, I'll listen to you. And this generation is the first generation that is going to have it worse than their parents in the last 100 years or so in America. Starting at the Great Depression, every generation had it better than their parents, economically and health-wise, education-wise, any way you could measure it. For the most part, they had it better. And this generation is going to have it worse, and they know it. Yeah, and they know that's happening. And The Dawn of Everything is the name of the book. But anyway,
we just needed to.
I'll get back to that.
Unlock it.
You need to think about something else, and then it comes.
Yeah, exactly.
But so they know that environmentally things are worse. They know economically things will be worse, and they know health outcomes are going to be worse, and on down the line. And so they're open to different ideas. And getting to that book, it was written by an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and it's a great read. It's a lot, so get it and spend some time on it. But what they go through is they show how all these different civilizations throughout history organize themselves in all different kinds of ways. The story we have been told is there's socialism over here and there's capitalism over here. There's nothing else. There's no other choices. You got to pick one or the other. If you pick this one, you're wrong. If you pick this one, you're right. It's like, well, no, that's not how things work. Social Security, pretty socialist. The insurance industry, pretty socialist. My favorite example is the NFL, the most popular sport in America.
Absolutely.
And it's a fascinating story. Like in the 60s, the owner of the New York Giants, which was the richest team, got together and he kind of led this he kind of led this the Mara family at the time. He led the push for revenue sharing for all the teams to share revenue equally, because he knew if he and Chicago and Cleveland or whoever else were the big teams at the time succeeded and nobody else did, they'd make less money and be less successful. So they organized. They didn't call themselves this, of course, but they organized as a socialist, construct where everything was shared. Now, when they're dealing with advertisers and television networks, they're very capitalist, and that's fine. That's what they do. But it's a huge socialist enterprise inside. And so there's...
Well, that kind of trickles all the way down. I mean, this is very, very topical right now for Chicago, which is the Bears are going after
local, I heard that story. Yes,
in state funds, and it's like it sort of transitions to that as well, of like taking on public funds in order to get a large capital benefit. So similar.
Yeah. But the upshot is that we can organize ourselves any way we want. It's the current way we're organizing ourselves. It economically benefits the few, and it hurts everybody else. Whether you're talking about economic outcomes or social outcomes or environmental outcomes or health outcomes or educational outcomes. So it doesn't work well for everyone. And so I think young people are more open to that conversation and that discussion. And it's interesting. Degrowth is I say it's a terrible word, but it's a word for the job.
I was going to ask about the word, and that's actually one of my follow-up questions is getting into that hard word to sell.
Yeah.
But I think you make a great point. You all make a great point in the papers talking about degrowth being really harsh by design. I mean, it can't be watered down similarly to sustainability or maybe ESG has.
Yeah, I mean, I understand people's, and this gets to meeting people where they are. If they say, "Oh, I hate degrowth," I was like, "Okay, well, what do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about a well-being economy? Do you want to talk about ecological economics? Do you want to talk about, ag growth is another one. It's agnostic to growth, but it's not degrowth. And they're all, or donut economics. They're not the exact same thing, but they all have very similar principles, or sometimes the same principles. And degrowth was a word that was meant to be a confrontational, a missile word, as the guy who invented it said.
I love that.
And that it can't be co-opted. Like, I came through the sustainability world, and, I've seen so many financial firms sell sustainability funds. And all they are is, not all of them, but many of them they were slightly tilted towards tech and away from oil and gas. So they'd have a little smaller evil footprint of oil and gas, and maybe they'd outperform, and you could sell it for a lot more money because people wanted to have something green. And it's the same with products. My favorite example of this is, I forget the company, but they sold, the little plastic soap dispensers that you put in your bathroom, you push the top and the soap comes out. They were selling a new environmentally friendly soap dispenser. All it was the same plastic soap dispenser, and they put a cardboard sleeve over it. So, and that was sustainable. Like, of course it's not, but it's just trying to do the minimum they can to get more money out of people. And that's not really sustainable. And so I see degrowth as truly sustainable. And again, it's not, people make it a political statement, but it's not. It's hewing to the laws of thermodynamics. It's the physics. You have to obey physics, and you have to obey chemistry. That's where it starts. And our economic system says, well, that doesn't really matter. Profit matters the most. And of course, that's going to lead to bad outcomes because we're overproducing and overconsuming. And getting those planetary boundaries, the end goal is to get those planetary boundaries within a place where we can live with them. And so degrowth is a path. It's not an end in of itself, but it's a path of slowing down the industries that are harming us, building up industries that we need that will help us. I think there's a great opportunity in the care economy with baby boomers all over the world. And I think there's kind of a grand bargain to make. Take people out of the industries and the focus on growth and focus on care. And it gets at the end game, I think, of all this is building more importance in people's lives and community. And that's
Well,
not
that
like
was
getting to some fictitious 1950s world that never existed. But with social media today and the quest for growth, we're on a treadmill running so fast all the time just to grow a little bit. If we had things like a 4-day work week and more investment in our communities and taking care of each other would be the most important thing, and not growth. And but that's a huge cultural change, and that's a different story we're telling ourselves, and that will take time. You don't just say, this is our national story tomorrow, but that can and will happen by disaster design. Let's design it.
Well, I think this actually takes, I love that you brought up care, because that was one of my favorite examples, and I'm trying to find now into my questions, but it was one of my favorite examples that you proposed, Arquetta, proposed around uh, essentially the for-profit motive in elder care,
Yeah.
that from a pension standpoint in the second paper, where we're talking about how essentially, and I'm trying to get the summation here correct, is we are investing in a system that is ultimately trying to outgrow us in terms of providing less for the
Yeah.
sake of returns.
Yeah.
And so I think that was such a really concrete example of sort of future returns not actually being focused on well-being or care, but actually still driving more returns.
Yeah. Like, for example, getting back to the GDP example,
Right.
but this will lead into the care example is
Yeah.
that, think of GDP and a system where you want to grow GDP, and GDP growth is the most important thing. And that's where we are now. Cigarettes are a fantastic business because they're addictive. People can't do without them. And then on top of them being addicted to cigarettes, they're great for the healthcare industry because you have to have a lot of long care for people with emphysema and lung cancer that they have to pay for, a lot of money for. So let's think of the examples of Matt never smoking and Matt smoking. You've got this customer for 30, 40 years, and then at the end of his life, he has to spend 5 to 10 years shelling out all this money for healthcare. That's a fantastic model for your GDP. Is that good for your society? No, but we don't care. We just want more growth. So yes, that's this extreme example, but that's in the GDP world, that's what matters most. And of course, that's not what matters most. Care should matter more. And so it's interesting. You see, no, smoking has gone down in the United States, for example, but we've outsourced it other places. So those companies are still making profits.
They're doing all right.
Yeah. Don't worry about them. But you can see, you can be a nerd and go through the data, how spending on healthcare related to that has gone down, and health outcomes just based on the smoking issue have gone up and been positive for our society. After, smoking kind of peaked in the 90s and the settlements with tobacco companies and everything. And so a huge amount less of people smoke now. I think it's less than half as many people smoke now than did 30 years ago. And that's fantastic health outcome. But we need to focus on, in the second paper, we talk about pensions, because pensions are a third of the world's assets. They own a third of everything in the world. And so they have immense power to change things. And our argument is, right now, pensions have to chase that growth. They have to grow, or they're legally not doing their job.
The fiduciary responsibility here, people.
The fiduciary responsibility is to grow assets. But of course, as a society, we want, and we break it down, and there's 5 different capitals, if you will. There's financial capital, which is financial assets or assets in your 401k or your retirement plan. There's manufactured assets, which are like buildings or your house. So financial assets in your house are the ones that focus on you the most. But there's also social capital, which is like your culture and your society. Human connection. Human capital is what is like workers. And natural capital, which underpins everything. But we treat those capitals as they're not as important. But our argument is pension funds should invest either directly or indirectly in those other capitals, and less so on financial capital. Now, that's going to mean lower returns, of course, in the future, but you're focusing on lifting up that care economy through natural capital. You have better water, more breathable air. Your health outcomes are going to be better. You have, community and social capital. It's going to help take care of you. And workers have more of a role in how things are done. And workers are taken care of more. They're not just treated as commodities to be, worked into the ground and then thrown away. And so those outcomes holistically are better than just focusing on gathering all these assets you can for the end of your life and then sitting around for 5 years trying to spend them, or 10 years, or whatever it is.
I mean, where is the argument in here to educate a finance professional? And again, there's a couple things wrapped up into this on the timeline, right? It's really hard for consumers, for the lay folks that are thinking about these concepts to go, oh, that's not my problem. That's 50 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
However, ignoring that, what I'm looking at is saying, where is this in the conversation and how do you present this, if it's correct,
Mm-hmm.
on saying, hey, don't, the future return or the returns that you're going to get now may not be what we deem of a standard. Maybe it's not your 15% year over year.
Yeah.
But your 15% year over year, if you keep going this direction, will end. And then you'll have 0%.
Yeah.
So where does that come into this framework of saying, hey, what if we went 5% or even 2% and year over year, and that can be sustained longer? Is that a part of this conversation?
Yes and no.
Okay.
One way to think of it is, global growth of the economy is somewhere around 2% now. I don't have the stats in front of me, but we aim,
that's kind of the sweet spot. Yeah.
You'll see governments say, their estimate of what they want growth to be is 2.5% or 2% or whatever. And then we all learned that, worshiping GDP, if GDP goes down 2 quarters in a row, that's a recession.
Right.
And that's terrible because the organizing principle of our economy is companies got to make money so you can have more things. But again, let's put it off to the side. That's not what we want our society to be doing. But to think about, if our society only grows at about 2% a year, global society, in about 30 to 35 years, we need to double all the resources and energy we have. Every 30, 35 years, and then double that again and again. We've already passed the planetary boundaries, remember?
Yep.
So how do we do that? We don't. It all breaks down before that. There's a book that was written in the 70s, Limits to Growth, which was it came out of MIT and the Club of Rome. And it was researchers looked at, okay, the way we're using resources, the way we're using energy, we think it might be unsustainable. Let's check that out. And think of, a lot of this was done in pencil and paper back then. Think of the computer power they had in the early 70s. But what they came up with was, about this time, about the middle of, between the 2000 and 2050, things would start breaking down. Systems would start collapsing. Economies would start collapsing. The food system would, start collapsing. The climate would start collapsing because it can't go on forever.
Wow. With pen and paper, they found that?
With pen and paper, they found it. But a researcher, she was at KPMG at the time, Guy Harrington, about 2000, 2001, revisited that and did the work with, modern computers.
Yeah.
And she found the same thing, that in the next 10 years or so, and some of these things are already starting to break down. Like, you can look at, government reports of, we're having more and more billion-dollar, natural disasters every year, and taking into account inflation. Like, so it was in the single digits 30 years ago, and now it's in the 20s and 30s, in the US, and it's the same around the world. And so we've gotten to the point where things are starting to break down. So that pension, like, I'm talking to 3 different groups of students in the next 2 months. And what I'll tell them is, I'm sorry, I'm just a messenger, and I check my work, go find this out for yourself. But the career you're told will provide for you for the next 40 years will not. And if we continue on this path, what it provides for you won't be worth anything, because you need society to have law and order that's respected, police that will help you protect your things. We're not going to have a Mad Max world tomorrow, but as those things slowly break down, think of all the systems in your life, from getting up to brush your teeth in the morning to turning off your light at night, to brushing your teeth again and turning off your light at night. Your transportation system, your legal system, your law system, how your food gets to you, the variety of food you have, how your home is heated and cooled, how the water gets to your home, how the sewage gets away from your home. All those things can break down. They're all, and I just named 6 there. There's dozens more. They can all break down and will start to break down. And I've been lucky enough in my life to travel to around the world to places where those systems have broken down or never existed. And so that world is coming to us, in some way, a simpler world by disaster design again. And so if we're expecting these returns to keep going, that's just not, the laws of thermodynamics, physics and chemistry will not allow that. In the end, Mother Nature has the last vote, and she always wins. So if the story we tell ourselves is that we need to chase GDP, we need to grow, which is, of course, it's so ingrained in our way of thinking that think of a politician or a CEO that doesn't promise growth. They're out of a job.
Yeah, it's the foundation of the question I just asked, which I'm even regretting, which is like again, infinite growth. But yes,
but that gets into normalizing this conversation,
right.
And understanding, like, look, most people will be at the first stage of 7 stages of grief.
I'm like 2.
Yeah,
yeah.
But educate yourself. To everyone listening to this, and you can talk to me or others like me, and yell at us if you want, but have these conversations. But it's just, in the end, it's just physics and chemistry that are in charge. It's not our economic system. It's not our political system. And our economic and political system will have a hard time changing. But they just have to. I can't say it any more plainly than that if this was a problem 200 years down the road, oh, great, we'd make small changes and we'll be fine. But change can happen rather quickly if people want it to. An example I give is there's this great photo, I forget who took it, but it's a photo of Easter Sunday in New York City in 1900. And it's from on top of a building looking down at the street. And there's one car and like 24 horses and buggies. This is 1900. 10 years after that, this photo was reversed. There's 1 horse and buggy and dozens of cars. In 10 years, think of the internet. I was in college and the internet came out, and I would run to the computer lab. I couldn't have a computer in my room. There was no, way to get the wires there.
No infrastructure.
No infrastructure for it. I went to the computer lab so I could do this crazy thing called email, where my friend and I, who was going to school down in Alabama, could type messages to each other. We thought it's insane and revolutionary. And that's not that far in the past. And other social movements as well. I mean, not so pleasant things like the French Revolution, those things happen quickly. So, everything looks like it's going to continue until it doesn't. And what's not sustainable can't be sustained. So let's plan this instead of just letting it happen to us.
Where do you think, I love that the disclaimer is getting more and more normal for these papers, where you said this was written by humans. What's your take? What's the AI take here in the degrowth community and world?
Skynet's coming for all of us. Was that what I should say?
I mean,
I don't know.
We can try to give some people some hope on that. Yeah.
Well, maybe Skynet's coming for all of us. I don't know. Maybe I'm.
Well, and then is there a possibility where that's a reset?
Theoretically, yes, but I would say realistically, no.
Yes, I would agree with that.
AI is just a technology, know, and we're the ones who misuse it or use it well. Most people are just using AI as a glorified search engine.
Yeah.
And it's good for that. I don't tend to use it a lot because I play with it like anybody else, but I don't want it or need it for my writing. I don't want an AI voice sneaking into the way I communicate and speak. And I'm lucky that a lot of what I'll be doing for the rest of my career is doing things like this. And there's not going to be an AI avatar that anybody's going to want to speak to, or going and speaking to classrooms or boardrooms Writing, I guess I could, but that's not honest,
Right.
for what we're doing. So it's funny that we put that disclaimer in our second paper, but wouldn't even think about it for the first one.
For the first one, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a year ago. But AI is just a tool. I think, yeah, and I think people are right to be scared of it, but also I think that fear is overblown a little bit. I mean, these large language models, they're just, kind of the average answer to everything. So it's great that you can have, whatever Claude or ChatGPT or whatever you use give you an answer. That's a great improvement over, Google 10 years ago. But you have to use it, and it's garbage in and garbage out. And, it's
That it
interesting.
is. Yeah.
It's interesting to see that, you know, it's a product meant to give people an answer. So even if it doesn't have a good
And
answer,
homogenize answers. Yeah.
it's homogenized answers. And if you say, no, that's a bad answer, I've seen things where it'll fight with you telling it, no, I'm right. It's like, well, no, you're not, and that will change and all that stuff. But it's a tool. I think, you know, I think by disaster design, we will use AI less and use it for, different purposes. Like what was it? The Sam Altman, the guy from
Yeah. OpenAI.
OpenAI, what he said last week. I don't know if I have the quote, super correct, but he was talking about how, someone was saying about how someone was complaining about all the energy that AI uses. And he shot back, well, yeah, but humans use a whole lot of energy too. Like you have to feed them and clothe them and house them for 20 years. And that's really inefficient. So unsaid in his answer was the whole point is efficiency. And so we can grow more, so we can have more stuff. No. The whole point is that
It's human.
that you have to raise for 0 to 20 years, and they can go out and have a fulfilling life and contribute a lot of non-economic things to other people's lives. So step back and think about it. The best things in all our lives are wildly inefficient and bad for GDP. It's hanging out with your friends. It's making dinner with your family. It's sitting around watching a game. Maybe you buy something that's advertised, But the whole point of our lives is to live. It's not to grow our economies. And a great analog for the whole GDP and growth thing is us. We stopped growing. I don't know about you, but I stopped growing when I was about 18.
Yep.
Most people, women finish growing a little faster than men finish growing, but it's 15 to 18-ish. We stop growing, and the rest of our lives are spent just maintaining and experiencing life. And so an analogy is, what if we as humans were forced to take growth hormone for our whole lives, starting at 18 or whatever? And for the last 100 years, everyone's done that. And that story has been normalized. That'd be a pretty grotesque existence.
Not a great human. Yeah.
Not a great human. You'd have lots of medical problems.
Yeah.
Yet that's what we're saying is natural and what the preferred route for our economy, which is destroying our environment. And it only benefits, the shareholders at the top. And I'm one of those. I have a 401k, just like everybody else, but I don't want that over the health of my children and the planet that I can live on. And so that's kind of a way to frame the argument of, there's no one natural way to do this. Let's pick one that doesn't destroy everything.
Yeah. On a raw thought here, I mean, I'm probably a little bit more dystopian when it comes to AI. And I'm trying to wrap myself around that a little bit. And it's mostly around the work that I do is entirely possible because of AI. And I could not convince a co-founder to join me in a journey in building a product. And so then I was able to do it myself without a human job. That's one job I have as a company that I was looking to give to someone.
Yeah.
And the only person I could get, and I shouldn't say person, the only entity I could get was an AI, essentially an AI co-founder that was able to build that product for me. And that's what's blowing my mind a little bit. And that's where I tend to,
Yeah, but there's, 8 billion people in the world.
Totally.
you know,
Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
that's one
That's a
story.
network problem. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
one story out of 8 billion. And I think, you know, AI is here to stay in some form.
Yep.
But I think just like, you were talking about before, the stock market being seen as success. And I don't have those stats in front of me, but something like the last year, not all, but like 75% of the growth of the stock market in the US is down to 8 companies, and they're all tech
Yeah.
companies and some AI companies. And AI is a bubble, just like the housing bubble before, the dot-com bubble before. Like these companies, not to get too wonky and finance about it, but like
No.
the PEs of these companies, the price to earnings ratio, it's the price of the company over their earnings. And that typically is about, I don't know, 15 to 20 is kind of the average of what a PE usually is. And I don't know what they are now, but it's like wildly above
It's
that.
wildly above
And
that.
anytime,
Yeah.
and that always reverts to the mean, because manias happen from the tulip mania in the Netherlands, hundreds of years ago, where people would buy a tulip bulb for the same price as their house. A bit ridiculous, but it got that bad. It got that mania, got that crazy. And we're in the same kind of mania now, and that will all crash. Just
Yep.
as the dot-com crash happened, and some companies survived and some didn't. And AI will survive and be used in some ways. But again, it's up to us to use it or misuse it. And again, by disaster design, I see community and building communities for care, but also resiliency, because bad environmental things will happen. So you'll need a local food system, you'll need local power, you'll need local water, and so forth. AI can help with those things, but it's not. We don't need AI to run everything. And so I think I'm curious the story that comes out of the crash, whatever that ends up being. I think that will chasten a lot of people who
Yeah.
were promising AI would solve everything, and then we'll settle into what AI is going to be in the future. But AI could be peaking right at the time as environmental collapse gets really serious, and when billions of people are refugees trying to walk around the country, and 10 to 20% of all our staple crops are failing. AI can't help with that. And so, well, it can't some, but it's that's kind of beside the point at that point.
Well,
So, I think, yeah, worry about AI, but worry about, your water and your air and your
right.
forest first.
And I think I think I do find myself almost asking for that reset. That it somehow is the catalyst towards change economically, towards what we're talking about here today. I think there's a part of me that goes, I want that to happen. I want there to be this moment that becomes very real for humanity to address our growth. And I think that's probably an element of this.
Well, it will happen. But again,
Yeah.
by disaster design.
By exactly.
And so,
Exactly.
but getting back to that, I was talking about the article by that guy from the New Yorker
Yeah.
is organizing beats mobilizing, is what he was saying. And those organizations aren't really built yet. I live in a small college town in Virginia, which is very nice, and it's a smaller community, so it's easier to get people together and do things than in New York or Los Angeles. But I think 20 years from now, my community will be much more tight knit, but more environmentally challenged, and those things go together. It's very easy to not know your neighbor and not care
Right.
about what your neighbor does and not have your neighbor's interests in heart when you don't think that has anything to do with you. And that's a lot where we are now. I'm lucky enough. I know we live kind of out in the country a little, and we know some of our neighbors, but not others. But, there could very easily be, I can see where we are. There could very easily be a local solar power station that supplements what we get from an energy company.
Right.
And there's, where I live is out in the country. So we could have a huge community garden that no one's felt the need for, but in 20 years, we probably will. And other things like that help your community to be
And
resilient. And that gets into care as we age. You know, it used to be you'd have 8 kids to take care of you in your old age. Now
That was the retirement.
you have 1 or 2. Yeah, that was retirement. You'd have 1 or 2, and they're gone across the country. Those dynamics and that story will change too. And so that reset will come. I hope it's more by design than disaster, but it'll be a combination, and it won't be evenly distributed around the world. Some places will do it very well, and some places won't. And I think, and this gets into a whole different conversation, but I think we will be much less people by the end of the century than we are now, because, the estimates I see, and there's no eugenics or Thanos snap or any of this or anything like that, but that just life will be more challenging.
Right.
The environmental problems will cause more deaths than we want them to, but they will. And, in many cases, having a child is an exercise in optimism. And when the future is more challenging, that will be less of an optimistic choice. And I see estimations of, people, the population of Earth topping out about 10 billion in 2070 or something like that, and slowly going down. I don't think we'll ever get there. And I think the discovery of oil and gas and the use of that, where a barrel of oil could do hundreds of times of work that you and I could do, has allowed agriculture to advance, has allowed all these things to advance to where maybe we got a little bit over our skis in population, for example. And I'm not saying let's call humanity. I'm saying that will naturally happen, that we'll see
limits are real.
Limits are real.
Yeah.
And that maybe by the end of the century, we're more in a sustainable population, whatever that is, if it's 6 billion or 5.5 billion or whatever it is, I don't know. But I think that's bound to happen as well.
To wrap this into real quickly, you spoke about that financial model of sort of decentralized power, decentralized food systems, community-based power, community-based food systems. Is that where this should head? Is that where finance should be funding those types of efforts and making that more of a reality? Is that where sort of this post-growth finance world comes into this?
I would say yes, just because it's more resilient that way.
Right.
And it's more democratic that way. I can see, in the States and other places too, we have, the whole states' rights and federal government rights argument that, goes back, to the founding of the nation. There's this great paper. I don't remember what it is, but I can look it up and give it to you to put in the notes. But that came out end of last year, and it was these folks who are one guy's in the U.S., one and the woman who wrote it's in the Netherlands, and they're talking about bioregionalism. It's kind of the way to frame how we govern things. And bioregionalism is, in a nutshell, kind of focusing first on the place you are and making sure you take care of your watershed, you take care of your forest, you take care of your river, you take care of your desert, if that's where you are, or your ocean, because that's what matters. The air and water and soil where you are matters. And let's be honest, for most of our lives, we've been able to take that for granted because things were fine. But we're spoiling those things. And so the bioregional movement is trying to focus people more on that and to take care of those things. And I want to get to, not just I, but part of what Archita wants to do is get those kind of groups together, the finance people and the bioregional people. And there's a great movement, bioregional financing facilities that's starting up, trying to get people in the financial world to fund rewilding, fund cleaning up the rivers, because or in our paper we argue for pension funds doing that, because again that's a natural capital we're neglecting. We should be taking care of. It doesn't matter how much money you have if you can't breathe, if you don't have clean water, if you don't have clean soil, and so on. And so I think that's another level to add to the governing of America or Canada or wherever you are, as you get people in place, as Native people did, all over the world for much of humanity, taking care of the water, taking care of the forest. And that's a responsibility of those people. And we organize around that. That brings your community together, gives you something to care for and protect. And it also guards against at the state level and the federal level, them coming in and saying, okay, we're taking this river, or we're doing whatever we want with this mountain, to give more power to the people locally to do those kind of things. And that takes finance to help facilitate that. So I think that's part of the whole model of, I think that's going to happen by disaster design, because people will need to be more resilient in their communities. But let's plan that, and let's
Right.
set up governance structures to help that. And I see that's a great model for things developing that way. But that's just starting in some places. There's that, like the Donut Economics Lab that's based in Europe. There's a couple of kind of test cities they have. Devon in England, Devon Donut is
Yeah.
something that people can look up. And I've heard of but places in the U.S. where they're trying to work with local authorities to have, and donut economics is operating within planetary boundaries. Your economy is below the planetary boundaries. The theory is, you operate environmentally below the planetary boundaries and above a level of poverty, whether that's money or housing or food. And so you're kind of in that sweet spot between those. So that's something to aim for.
Love it. As we round this out, I'd love to do a couple quick hits
Sure.
questions here. So which one do you think we're currently headed for in disaster or design? I mean, how do you maintain hope in that question?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
No,
That's good. I'll take that.
no, but like I said, it's not, collapse, whatever you want to call it, is coming, but it won't be evenly distributed. And the more we try to design it, and the more we plan for it, and the more we set up resilient systems, the better off we'll be. We've lived through this. If you step back and take a wide view of human history, the discovery of oil and gas has allowed us to kind of supercharge our use of resources. And, population and wealth and use of things was, going for a very steady line. And then we just had this hockey stick up for the past 100 years. And that will go back down to something that is over the long term sustainable. That will feel like a crash and the end of everything, but it won't be. It will be
Right.
the end of the system we know now, which is not sustainable. So we can't keep it going. So let's find a way to, coast as much as we can down that line and get to something that's sustainable. So there will be disaster, there will be design. And I encourage people who are interested in this to go out and help build that next system that does start local. But as more and more people are doing things locally, that changes the narrative, that changes the story we tell ourselves, that influences the story we tell ourselves. 30 years from now, I would imagine CEOs and politicians will be judged more on those outcomes than growing GDP, because it'll be so obvious to everyone.
Two more.
Sure.
What's the most underappreciated argument for why finance professionals should care about planetary boundaries?
Because they care about you. They rule your life. The example I give, I think I already gave it, was like, it was physics that killed the dinosaurs. It wasn't economics. We're living in a Mother Nature's world. And the environment, our economy is just a small subset of what's inside of our environment. And we treat it like it's the other way around. And we ignore that at our peril. And so learn as much about it as you can, and understand that, when I got out of school, I had 30 to 40 years of a career, whatever it was, ahead of me that was going to be, I could pretty much achieve anything I wanted because the world was on upward trajectory. It's not going to be. That's not fair, but it's not. And so adjust to that. And I would try to get people to think about how can they be part of that solution to building that resilience in their communities, or whatever their skills can be and can do. But, being a junior investment banker working 10 hours a day for 10 years just to be an investment banker to go rule the world in 20 years, that's not going to be an option. That's the extreme, but that,
Right.
that world isn't going to be there anymore.
Right.
focused on infinite growth when you're in your 40s and 50s and 60s. It's just not. And so try to anticipate the world as it's going to be, and can you best fit into that? And, I wouldn't say I have hope or don't have hope. I think that's a tricky word, because I think if people have hope, a lot of that is they're hoping someone else is taking care of it. And that's not going to happen. You have to take care of it to the extent you can. But if you help build that community, you're a resilient community where you live, you'll take care of other people and they'll take care of you. And you'll be all right. It'll be a
That,
different world. You'll have less stuff, but you need less stuff.
right.
The book I was talking about before, they give an example of the dawn of everything. They give an example of a lot of the Native American peoples didn't understand the European way of life, and they thought they had a much richer life than the Europeans. The Europeans had more material possessions, but they were miserable compared to the Native peoples. Now, they wiped out the Native peoples, because they had better violence, I guess, but they weren't as happy. They had less egalitarian societies. And you could argue that, that way of life, if the Native people's way of life had been victorious, however that was, we would be in a very different place now. Not that one's better than the other, but one has led to this all-consuming growth narrative story we're telling ourselves that we're just kind of lying to ourselves in the end about.
You kind of were leading into the last question, which is, what's one thing every person can do now that counts as investing in their retirement, but has nothing to do with money?
Well, I would say, as uncomfortable as it is, get on that grief journey, but that's just the framing I use because that's out there.
Right.
But get past denial however you can, and acceptance won't happen tomorrow or next week, but get on that journey. There's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people who want to be on the journey with you. There's a great survey that came out. There's two different great surveys that came out in the UK last year. One of them just surveyed people. One of them surveyed business professionals, and it was about degrowth. And most people didn't like the word degrowth, but they liked the policies behind degrowth, which is like working less focus on growth, more focus on communities, all those kind of things. You can research that. And they wanted that, but they thought no one else wanted that. They thought they were alone wanting that. But about 80% of the people wanted that. And so there's a quiet majority out there who doesn't know that there's a better way. And we think there is, because the story we're told is, look, it's capitalism. We won. The wall came down. This is all there is. And capitalism is just a tool. It's not good or evil. It's just like AI. There's the people behind it are making the decisions, and you at the local level in your community can be part of making that better system. That, when capitalism collapses, whatever that looks like, people are looking around for what other ideas are out there. And these are the kind of ideas we think will build the next system, whatever it's called. Historians 200 years from now will decide that. I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah.
But like feudalism
New buzzword.
Feudalism wasn't replaced by capitalism on a Tuesday. It happened
Right.
over a long time. And whatever comes next, it will be a similar story. So be part of, however you can, be part of building that where you live.
Matt, thank you for joining us today. This was so much fun.
Thanks. I'm interested in hearing feedback. And again, I'm the only Matt Orsagh in the world. I can't hide. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn or social media. I have a Substack that I write on degrowth. Again, I'm the only Matt Orsagh. You can find me there. And find other people who are talking about this stuff, and find, read books and listen to other things, and educate yourself and help build that system.
I'm excited for the feedback. It's going to be good. I know that either way.
Yeah. No, I had a lot of fun.
You.
Thanks for having me.